I was expecting to find my daughter beat up, covered in bruises. But I walked in the bedroom and I could see a big hole in my baby's head.
The crime scene was so brutal, you don't even believe that what you're looking at is real. There was blood and tissue and different pieces of the victims that were all over from ceiling to floor. It was 360 degrees of just terror.
Oh my God, I just lost it. You always hear about this stuff happening to families. And you think that it's not ever gonna happen to your family. But, no, I do not think that Jordan is evil. And I'm not saying that just because he's my son. Sometimes I just wished it was all a dream and I could just wake up. This is Jordan's dad and me and Jordan in Savannah, Georgia. Jordan was always so full of life. Yep, we were very happy. Jordan was very adventurous. He would hide on me all the time and I couldn't find him. I would find him down inside the dryer. He took sand and he poured it inside of our riding lawnmower in the gas tank. He was very mischievous when he was little. But Jordan loved everybody. He was easygoing, happy all the time. In 2012, around the age of 20, Jordan came to Tennessee with me. His dad and I had split up. I was remarried, and that's when he started going to the college, going to school, working at a pizza place. And that's when he met Kiera. And they started dating. I liked her a lot, very outgoing. She fit right in. I mean, he was truly in love with her. I would say that Kiera and Jordan dated for probably a year before she became pregnant. I was super excited, you know, I was gonna be a grandma. And Jordan was just ecstatic because that's what he always wanted. He wanted his own little family.
Kiera was just the most loving child you can imagine. And she loved her mom, you know, and her mama loved her. Kiera didn't tell me about Jordan until she was pregnant. Kiera set me and my husband down. It's like, you know, I hate to say this, but I'm pregnant. I asked who he was, and she said Jordan Hazel, and he wasn't from around here. I said, are we talking marriage? What are we talking about? And she says, no. She said, I actually want to live with you, Mom, and see how this thing goes. And I was so happy she said that because I didn't know him. I wanted Kiera to take her time. And that's how Jordan was brought into the family. When I first laid eyes on him, he was just gorgeous. He was the most perfectest baby. You know, which all grandmothers are going to say that, but he was exceptional. You know, he was the prettiest baby you ever saw. Seeing Jordan and Kira hold Caden, it was amazing. He was so excited. Kira just cried and said, "Mama, look, he's so perfect." And I said, "Yeah, baby, he is. He's a perfect baby, and he's absolutely beautiful." It was love at first sight when they saw Kate. Just like a little happy family. You think, oh, this is going to be a great ending, you know. But not so much in this case.
So when I got the call for this case, it was in the earlier morning hours that there was a homicide that had occurred, and the suspect was actually taken into custody on scene. Being that we already had somebody in custody, the most important thing for me to do at the time is speak with the suspect and figure out what happened. Very much so on the fly from the start. I just didn't have a whole lot, you know, to go off of.
All right, you turn around. Turn around, have a seat right here for me, sir. You want any water?
Yeah, I'll take a glass of water, sir.
Okay, all right.
I appreciate it.
Yes, sir.
He was polite. He was very friendly and kind of meek. It was definitely not what I expected to see as the suspect of the murder.
Hey, I just want to confirm, you're Jordan?
Yes, sir.
Hazel, is that how you say it, sir?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Jordan Michael Hazel.
Okay, sir.
I don't know anything at this point. I only had about 15 or 20 minutes or so before I was in the interview room with him. But, you know, that's just how it worked out. We have a suspect, we have a crime, and we have somebody that's ready to talk. What we have to do is, you know, get in there and talk to him and find out as much as we can.
When Jordan was around 17, things really changed. He was using drugs, and then he was drinking on top of it. I always assumed that it was maybe his childhood trauma was resurfacing again. Jordan was molested when he was a child. It started when he was about 2 years old and went till he was 5. And I had him in therapy when he was younger. I just assumed that, okay, maybe he needs to go talk to somebody again. And of course, he didn't want to listen to me. He wanted to do what he wanted to do. And it just escalated and got worse, and he ended up getting arrested. That's when he got out of there and moved to Tennessee with me. But he was still a very sweet boy. Even though all this was going on, he was still sweet. When Caden was born, I thought, okay, you know, he's finally growing up, and I was excited.
When Caden was born, I stayed with them for a week. Just, you know, to give her rest and help with the baby and different stuff. He was smoking and he went out on the patio, and I had walked out there with him. He said, you know, I need to tell you something. I was arrested for counterfeiting. And I'm like, counterfeiting? And he said, yeah. I was like, does Kira know this? And he's like, yeah, Kira knows it. And I was like, what happened? And he said, well, he said, I was counterfeiting money. And he said, I've got an 8-year prison sentence that I'm supposed to be in Georgia on probation. And it took me by shock. After he had went to work, I asked her, I was like, why didn't you tell me that Jordan was arrested, had been in prison for counterfeiting? And she said, Mom, that was his past. She said, he's changed, and that was before he met me. And I was like, well, it would still been nice to have known, Kira. And she said, well, I don't want y'all thinking bad of him, you know? And I was like, okay, I understand. And so in my mind, he's done his time. He's on probation. And everything's was okay. Oh, the wedding was beautiful. She was just extra beautiful that day, you know, in her dress, and just all smiles and a glow that I've never seen before. Just, she was so excited about starting a new life. After the wedding, that's when she told me she was pregnant with Jalen. Well, I was happy, you know, another grandbaby. Who's not going to be excited? Just whatever mom wants for their daughter, you know, you get that quiet time before you have to hand them off to someone that's supposed to love and care for them. And you think you're handing them off to a better life and spread their wings and they're going to fly. It didn't work out the way I wanted it to.
Oh, you sit down. You're fine. When I sit down and talk to him, he agreed to interview. He waived his rights. He was a little bit more quiet at first, but he answered my questions. My focus was trying to establish a timeline of events. He said he had worked that day, come home from work. It was somewhere around 6 p.m. And he had some sort of a verbal disagreement with Kira. After that, he had got into his vehicle, in which I later found out that was to retrieve the shotgun that he used during the crime. And he said he started loading the gun up. He loaded the gun up in the truck. So you got shotguns all loaded up and everything?
Yeah.
He went inside the residence and he went through the hallway. He said that he called his wife Kira to him. And she comes out, and she what? Is she in the doorway? Is she in the hallway, or is she?
She's still in the bedroom.
So she's
waiting out of the bedroom.
So you call her, and how many times did you shoot her?
I shot her twice.
Why twice, I guess.
I don't know. I shot twice.
I was definitely shocked that he said that, but after he shot her was the more shocking part, which was after he shot her, then he left the residence. Well, inside the residence is still Caden and Jalen, a 3-year-old boy, and about a 9-month-old girl. And that Caden had actually come up to him, obviously scared. He probably saw part of it and definitely heard it. Jordan is in the process of leaving the house. He actually shoves him back in the house and he shuts the door and leaves. I'm not saying it's normal for a husband to shoot their wife, but for someone to shoot their wife or their loved one in the presence of the children and then literally leave your child in a house with your wife dying and bleeding, writhing in pain, that's shocking. Just makes you go, oh my God, this is awful. This is, horrific. That's evil. And it was right around that point where I took a break and went out and started to kind of gather my thoughts.
When you took this break, did you already know that his children were dead?
No.
When Jalen was born, Jordan wasn't the same happy self like he was with Caden. I never seen him smile during the whole thing. And within, I'd say, 3 months of Jalen being born, I'm loving on Caden, and he's like, Granny, Daddy's mean to my mama. And I was like, Daddy's mean to mama? He said, yes, Daddy makes my mama cry, and he hurts my mama. I had to hold my composure because there's a 3-year-old that's telling me that his mama's getting hurt. And so I kind of just said, well, Caden, is Daddy hurting you? And he said, no, but he makes my mama cry. And I did question Kira about it, and she's like, Mom, she's like, we're gonna be okay. We're gonna be okay. And that was about all she would say. She never went into detail. There was no real red flags until the bruises started appearing. And I was like, Kira. She said, well, we got into it and he just grabbed me for a second. And you could see the handprints around her neck. And I was like, well, it's not okay that he's choking you. And that was all she would, it's not a big deal. I handled it. Everything's taken care of.
No. I never saw Kira and Jordan fight with each other. No. Anytime I saw them, they were always happy. They were always happy. I never saw any kind of bruises, physical abuse to Kiera from Jordan. Jordan took flowers home to her all the time. Jordan bought her gifts all the time. He never, ever abused her. And he was a good dad, a very good dad.
Her family mentioned that they had noticed bruises on her before.
No. I know he didn't abuse her, so no. And I mean, and if they say that he did, well, then how come they didn't do something about it? Why didn't they step in and do something if they were so concerned about it? So I don't believe that at all. Jordan was 20 years old. He told me that he could hear the voices through the radios and he could hear them through the television. And they were telling him to do things that he shouldn't be doing. I didn't think anything of it and told him just shut the radio off, shut the TV off, don't listen to it, Jordan. And you won't have to worry about it. He hadn't mentioned anything about hearing voices or anything in several years. So I thought that maybe it was just a phase that he was going through. And then all of a sudden it came back again. So I suggested several times for him to go to a counselor or go see a doctor. You know, he said he didn't need to do any of that.
When we left off, we were at him leaving the house. And he told me that he left the house and he kind of led me to believe that he was going to drop the shotgun off, but he didn't. He had turned around and went back to the house. He went inside and he encountered his 3-year-old boy, Caden, in the hallway. Caden had run up to him and trying to give him a hug, and he pushed him back with his hand to get him back far enough to where he could shoot him.
He was trying to follow me around, and then I called him, you know, over by the spare bedroom, and that's when I shot him. I think I shot him in the head too.
That was extremely shocking. I wasn't expecting that. Thinking of him shooting a child with a shotgun, you know, I couldn't even imagine. But you can't just fall apart in the middle of the interview. It doesn't help the case. It doesn't help anybody. And, you know, our whole job is to speak. To speak for all the victims. So, we can't just fall apart. He said after he had shot his son in the hallway that he had went into the bedroom, and that's where Jalen was, in the playpen. She was about 9 months old, in a onesie.
And then I went in and shot Jalen in her bed. Shot Jalen once and shot Caden once, and I did the same thing again.
Shot everybody again. So everybody essentially got shot twice.
Right.
All right. What was the reason behind that?
Just felt like that's what I had to do.
That's what you need to do.
Where do you think he was at right now?
Karen. She's the one that discovered the bodies.
I happened to be up reading the Bible when Cindy called from Texas. And she said, Karen, I hate to ask you to do this. She said, but Jordan, he's acting strange. Will you go up there and check on things? And I said, yeah, I'll get ready and go on up there. I was expecting to find my daughter beat up, covered in bruises. But when I got out and knocked on the door, I could hear the TV, but nobody came to the door. So I beat some more and nobody came. Well, I called Kira's phone and Jordan answered it. And I said, Jordan, let me in. And he's like, Karen, you don't want to come in here. And I told him, I said, Jordan, you got 5 seconds to unlock this door or I'm calling for a welfare check. And I heard the door unlock. And he opened the door. He was eating a bologna sandwich. And I said, Jordan, this has got to stop. And he said, it's done, it's over. In my mind, he's leaving. It wasn't registering it could be anything other than that. And I was like, where's Kira? And he said, she's in the bedroom. He said, you don't want to go back there. I said, what, Jordan? Is she covering up bruises? Is she hiding what you've done to her this time? And he says, Karen, I'm telling you, you don't want to go back there. I walked down the hallway, and I walked in the bedroom. I pushed open the door. I looked down, and Kira was at the foot of the bed, and I could see a big hole in my baby's head. And I knew that she wasn't alive.
When we first spoke, you asked me if I had heard the 911 call.
I want to hear it.
You want to hear
I-
it?
Because I don't remember. I mean, I remember, but I don't remember.
Stop screaming, I can't get you help. Listen to me. Listen to me.
Oh my God!
Yelling, it makes it very difficult to understand.
I'm trying to calm down.
Okay,
I just walked in and my child is dead.
Okay, what's going on?
I go back there and my child's brain just spread.
Okay, ma'am, I understand you're in a very unsafe situation.
Where are my grandbabies? Where are my grandbabies? Please tell me you didn't have my grandbabies. I want to know. Please. Oh, no. Oh, God, please help me.
Is her husband still there?
I got him on the ground outside. Please get somebody here because I can't take much more.
Everybody is on the way to you, okay?
Please.
Children that you're saying you can't look
I need to get outside. I know they're dead.
Are you saying that the children are also? How many children?
The children are dead.
Remember, start dialing 911, and I'm trying to back out of the bedroom. Her hallway is hardwood flooring. It was kind of tacky, gluey feeling. I remember slipping. I kept sliding. I felt something on the back of my leg. And I knew it was Caden. And I kept saying, I've stepped on this baby. I've stepped on this baby. And I'm screaming. I just remember screaming. Jordan's still on the couch, and he's holding his ears, and he's rocking. And he said, I'll do whatever you say if you'll stop screaming. And he said, I'll go outside and I'll get on the ground. And I told him, I said, go get on the ground. Get out of here. And that's what he did. Finally, I seen a police officer come. And I kept screaming, he's killed my babies. And then this officer's like, we need to come in. Let us in. And I kept telling him no, that nobody else was going to hurt my babies. I was trying to protect them, I guess. And then finally this one officer, he grabbed my hand. And he said, we're here to help your babies. If he hadn't said that, I probably wouldn't have ever let nobody in.
I knew something was wrong when Kiara called me. She was very upset, crying, said that Jordan had took their wedding picture and ripped it in half and threw his half in the trash. And she said he was just mumbling, saying things that made no sense whatsoever. And I said, well, where's he at? And she said, I don't know, he left and went somewhere. And I said, well, if you don't feel safe, Kiara, don't stay there. I said, just pack the kids up, get in your vehicle and leave. And she goes, no, I'm fine. He'll be fine. Everything will be okay. I said, okay. And then I text her again, probably about 9:30, and I never got a response back from her. Jordan called me, and I could tell something was not right with him, and he hung the phone up on me. And that's when I called Kiara's mom. And I said, something is not right here. You need to go down there. And then I got a phone call from my ex-husband. And he said that Jordan has killed Kiara and the kids. Oh my God, I just lost it. I broke down. I was screaming, crying. I said, my son has just killed his family. My son has just shot and killed his family. You always hear about this stuff happening to families. And you think that it's never going to happen to your family. How could somebody do that? Sometimes I just wished it was all a dream and I could just wake up.
When I pulled up to the crime scene to look at it and to get a walkthrough for the first time, you could see that everybody was wore out, mentally exhausted. The crime scene was so brutal and so shocking to the conscience that you don't even believe that what you're looking at is real. The first thing I notice is in the hallway, I notice there's a blanket. And then I get a little bit closer and I notice that the blanket is covering up the 3-year-old boy. His hand is sticking out. It implied to me that when Jordan had killed him, that he knew it was wrong, which is why I believe he covered him up. In the master bedroom, right there towards the corner of the room, there was a playpen, and that's where Jaylen was, on her back from where she'd been shot in the head. This is definitely the most shocking thing that I've ever seen in my entire life. Some of the images will definitely, you can't get rid of. They stick in the back of your head forever. The crime scene was so gruesome and so violent that there was actual blood and tissue and different pieces of the victims that were all over from ceiling to floor. It was 360 degrees of just terror.
So what did you think you had to gain out of all this?
To get my life back.
During the course of the interview, I'd asked him multiple times what he was trying to gain out of all this graphic violence. He stated that he wanted to get rid of his past, to kill his past. And that was why he killed his entire family.
So what do you think the next part of your life is now?
I have no idea, but I'm ready to do whatever God's will may be.
2 weeks prior to her murder, Kira was at work and she called and she said that Jordan told her to leave and be gone by the time he got home. And she said, Mom, will you meet me there at 3? I was like, yes, thank you, Lord. You know, I'm getting my baby out of here. And so we get back to my house and we come in and we sit down and Kira's phone rings. And you could hear him screaming, you know, get home now. And she said, okay. And I was like, baby, don't go. She said, I made a vow before God to love this man for better or for worse. And she said, that's what I'm going to do. I said, well, leave the kids here. And she's like, no. She goes, Mom, he will never hurt these kids. I wish I could have hogtied her. I wish I could have forced her like she was a kid. And this would have been avoided. I had to let her live her life. His mom is not that innocent. She was trying to make me believe that Jordan was insane. But there was no insanity to this. What he done was pure evil. He set out to do it. He knew what he was doing. But, you know, maybe that's her way of coping of what her son really did.
I hold anger against Kiara's mom because I was very open with her on everything that I thought was going on with Jordan, and I tried to reach out to her several times and she would have nothing to do with me. So I didn't do anything wrong. I never wanted Jordan walking out on the streets again, because what if he snaps again and he does it to somebody else? What I did want for him was him to be placed in a mental institution where he could get the help that he needed. Jordan was diagnosed by, I think there was 6 doctors on the stand that all said he was paranoid delusional schizophrenia, and that they did not feel that he would ever be competent to stand trial. But the judge said otherwise. But no, I do not think that Jordan is evil. And I'm not saying that just because he's my son.
To this day, it's still the most horrific crime scene that we've ever had in the history of our city. He's done the most horrific acts that I've seen one human do to another in my lifetime. It's just, it's unspeakable. He is in jail, and he won't be able to hurt anybody else for the remainder of his life. You know, people are safer with him exactly where he's at.
I have lost Kiara, I have lost Caden, I have lost Jalen, and I've lost Jordan. When he took their lives, his life was gone too, because he's never been the same. I don't hold anything against Kiara's family. I mean, I've always loved them and always thought of them as my family. I would love it if one day we could actually speak to each other. Life is way too short, and I've learned that just by what I've lost.
there's days that God has to get me through. One thing it's taught me, though, is I make time. I make time with my other kids, my other grandkids. I got as much time as they need. It's just like with Cindy. I know I'm upset and I'm mad and it sounds terrible, things that I've said, but I hope that one day me and her can come to a cordial gathering for the sake of our grandkids. Kira's birthday was just Thursday, and it was a tough day. Her birthdays are always tough. But I know she's with God, and I have peace in that nobody can hurt her or Caden or Jalen ever again.
There are crimes that make headlines for a week, disappear from television screens, and slowly fade into the background noise of history. Then there are the cases that refuse to die. The kind that linger in abandoned evidence rooms, in fading newspaper clippings, in whispered conversations between neighbors who still lock their doors before sunset. They become more than investigations. They become warnings. Ghost stories told with real names. In the spring of 2001, one quiet Ohio community found itself living inside one of those stories, and nobody imagined that the answer would remain buried for decades before exploding inside a courtroom when almost everyone believed the truth had vanished forever. The town looked ordinary from every direction. Brick houses lined narrow streets. Children rode bicycles until the streetlights flickered on. Pickup trucks filled the grocery store parking lot every Saturday morning. Nothing about the place suggested that it would become the setting for one of the state's most haunting cold cases. People trusted their neighbors. Front doors were left unlocked. Everyone believed they knew everyone else. That illusion shattered on a rainy Friday evening. 26-year-old Emily Carter never arrived home. She had finished work just after 5 in the afternoon at a small insurance office less than 15 minutes from her apartment. Several co-workers remembered seeing her laughing as she walked toward the parking lot carrying a blue umbrella. One waved goodbye. Another joked about the weather forecast. Emily smiled, climbed into her aging silver sedan, and drove away. That was the last confirmed sighting. When she failed to answer her mother's evening phone call, nobody panicked. Emily occasionally worked late or visited friends without warning. But by Saturday morning, concern turned into alarm. Her apartment remained untouched. Her purse was missing. Her toothbrush was dry. Her cat cried behind the front door. The bed had never been slept in. Her family contacted police before noon. At first, investigators treated the disappearance like countless others. Adults sometimes left voluntarily. Relationships ended unexpectedly. Financial troubles caused people to disappear for days. Detectives checked hospitals, contacted friends, reviewed credit card activity, and searched nearby highways. Hours became days. Days became weeks. Then they found her car. It sat alone in an abandoned gravel lot nearly 20 miles outside town, hidden behind a line of overgrown trees. The driver's door was locked. The keys were gone. There were no obvious signs of violence. Rain had washed away countless potential footprints before officers arrived. Inside the vehicle, investigators discovered Emily's jacket folded neatly across the passenger seat. Her coffee cup still rested inside the center console. The radio remained tuned to the same station she listened to every morning. There was one detail nobody could explain. The driver's seat had been pushed dramatically backward. Emily stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall. She always drove with the seat positioned close to the steering wheel. Family members confirmed it. Co-workers confirmed it. Mechanics who had serviced the vehicle confirmed it. Someone much taller had almost certainly driven that car after Emily. That single observation transformed a missing person report into something far darker. The crime scene expanded rapidly. Search teams combed nearby woods. Mounted officers crossed muddy fields. Volunteers carried flashlights through dense patches of forest while helicopters circled overhead. Divers searched ponds and creeks despite freezing water temperatures. Every mile revealed nothing except silence. As local news stations increased coverage, tips flooded the sheriff's office. Someone reported seeing a silver sedan near an isolated gas station. Another claimed Emily argued with an unidentified man days before disappearing. A truck driver believed he had witnessed a woman matching her description standing beside the highway shortly after sunset. Each lead collapsed under scrutiny. Detectives reconstructed Emily's final known hours almost minute by minute. Security cameras in 2001 were rare and often low quality. One grainy recording from a convenience store appeared to show a vehicle resembling hers driving east just after 6 o'clock, but the image blurred beyond recognition. It was impossible to identify the driver. Without a body, investigators faced an impossible puzzle. Rumors filled the empty spaces where evidence should have been. Some believed Emily had uncovered financial fraud at work. Others whispered about a jealous former boyfriend. A few insisted a serial predator was traveling through Ohio during that period. The theories multiplied because facts remained painfully scarce. The town changed almost overnight. Parents no longer allowed children to walk home alone. Joggers carried whistles. Businesses installed brighter exterior lighting. Every unfamiliar vehicle attracted suspicious glances. The disappearance infected daily life with quiet fear. Meanwhile, detectives examined Emily's relationships one by one. Her co-workers described her as dependable, organized, and remarkably kind. Friends called her cautious. She rarely accepted rides. She almost never changed plans without informing someone. Her financial records showed no unusual activity. No secret bank account. No unexplained withdrawals. No evidence suggesting she intended to vanish voluntarily. Everything pointed toward interruption. Something had happened between the office parking lot and home. But what? Forensic technicians processed the recovered sedan using every method available at the time. Fingerprints covered the interior, most belonging to Emily herself. Several partial prints proved too smudged for comparison. Tiny fibers collected from the trunk revealed nothing conclusive. Hair samples lacked usable roots for DNA testing under the standards of that era. Soil recovered from the tires suggested the vehicle had traveled across multiple rural roads, hardly unusual for the region. Every laboratory report ended with nearly identical language. Inconclusive. The word haunted investigators. Weeks turned into months. Television crews disappeared. National attention faded. Volunteers returned to ordinary life. Only Emily's family refused to surrender. Every birthday became another reminder. Every holiday carried one empty chair. Her mother continued dialing her daughter's old phone number long after the service had been disconnected, unable to erase the contact from memory. Detective Michael Donovan, the lead investigator, developed an almost personal obsession with the file. He filled shelves with handwritten notes, maps covered in colored pins, interview transcripts, and timelines stretching across entire office walls. Colleagues joked that he knew Emily's final day better than his own. He did not laugh. Something felt wrong from the beginning. Not dramatic. Not obvious. Just wrong. He often returned to one question. Why move the driver's seat? If someone intended to steal the vehicle, abandoning it only miles away made little sense. If Emily had willingly given someone a ride, why was there no trace of that individual? If an abduction occurred, why leave behind almost no physical evidence? The case refused to follow familiar patterns. As years passed, technological advances promised hope. Evidence boxes left sealed inside climate-controlled storage slowly became more valuable than investigators had imagined. New DNA techniques emerged. Fingerprint databases expanded nationwide. Digital enhancement improved aging surveillance footage. Every breakthrough encouraged another review. Still nothing. The case officially became a cold case. Those two words carried enormous weight. Cold case. Not forgotten. Simply waiting. Waiting for science. Waiting for conscience. Waiting for luck. The community tried to move forward. Children who remembered Emily's disappearance graduated from high school. New families purchased homes without realizing why older residents hesitated whenever conversation drifted toward the abandoned gravel lot outside town. The insurance office where Emily had worked changed ownership twice. Even the trees surrounding the location where her car had been discovered grew taller, slowly hiding the place from passing traffic. Time erased details. Witnesses moved away. Memories softened. Some died. Others convinced themselves they remembered things that never happened. Cold cases do not merely lose evidence. They lose certainty. One retired deputy later admitted that the hardest part was watching possibilities disappear one by one. An unidentified fingerprint no longer mattered if the person who left it could never be identified. A forgotten conversation became meaningless once every participant passed away. Justice, he said, was racing against memory itself. Emily's father never accepted the idea that someone could simply vanish forever. Every anniversary of her disappearance, he drove the same route she would have taken home from work. 15 minutes. One ordinary drive. 15 minutes that somehow swallowed an entire life. He always stopped near the abandoned lot. He would stand beside the gravel, staring across the trees, trying to imagine what Emily might have seen during her final moments. No answers ever came. Only silence. Then another strange detail surfaced. Not immediately. Not loudly. Almost by accident. A retired mechanic contacted investigators nearly 8 years after the disappearance. He claimed that sometime during the week Emily vanished, an unfamiliar man had asked unusual questions about replacing worn floor mats inside a silver sedan. At the time, the conversation meant nothing. Years later, after seeing an anniversary television special, the memory returned with unsettling clarity. The description was frustratingly vague. Tall, broad shoulders, dark baseball cap, possible scar near one eye. Nothing investigators could verify. Nothing strong enough to justify an arrest. Yet Detective Donovan wrote the statement into the growing file anyway. Because cold cases survive on fragments. A single forgotten sentence. A faded receipt. An overlooked fingerprint. A witness who suddenly remembers one impossible detail decades later. He believed answers rarely arrived dramatically. They accumulated quietly until the impossible finally became undeniable. No one in town knew it then, but somewhere inside the mountains of sealed evidence, overlooked interviews, and forgotten laboratory reports, the truth was already waiting. It had survived changing administrations, retiring detectives, broken filing cabinets, floods of paperwork, and years of disappointment. It remained invisible, patient, silent. And one day, long after many believed the mystery would never be solved, that hidden truth would walk into a courtroom and leave an entire community staring in stunned disbelief. The mechanic's statement should have been a footnote, one of thousands of cold, incomplete recollections buried in the file cabinet of a forgotten investigation. But Detective Michael Donovan treated it differently. Because cold cases rarely die from lack of evidence alone, they die from people deciding the evidence no longer matters. And Donovan had built his entire career on refusing that surrender. So the moment the description of a tall man with a dark cap and a possible facial scar entered the system, he pulled the file back onto his desk, as if it had never left, as if the years had not passed at all, as if Emily Carter had vanished only yesterday instead of slipping into the slow erosion of time. He started where every investigator starts when everything else fails, not forward, but backward, rebuilding the last known hours again, and again until the timeline stopped behaving like a straight line and began to fracture into possibilities, because Emily's final afternoon had always been deceptively clean on paper. Office exit at 5:12 p.m., brief exchange in the parking lot, ignition at 5:18 p.m., then nothing, but Donovan refused to accept the simplicity of that structure, because simplicity, in a missing person case, usually meant someone had worked very hard to erase the complexity. He pulled archived employment records, re-interviewed coworkers who had long since moved on with their lives, tracked down a receptionist who now lived in another state and barely remembered the office, and each conversation added nothing dramatic, nothing that would trigger an immediate breakthrough, only small inconsistencies, the kind that normally get ignored, except Donovan had learned that in cold cases, the smallest inconsistency is often the only place truth survives. One coworker mentioned, almost casually, that Emily had been unusually quiet in the final week before she disappeared, not depressed, not anxious, just distracted, as if her attention was split between two realities. Another recalled her asking about changing her usual parking spot, a detail that never made it into the original report because at the time it sounded meaningless, but now it carried weight, because changing parking behavior in the days before a disappearance often suggests awareness of risk, even if the person themselves does not fully understand why. Donovan expanded outward from Emily's orbit, not just friends and co-workers, but everyone who had intersected her routine, gas station attendants, nearby drivers, maintenance workers at the office building, and that's when he found something that had never been properly connected to the case, a security log from a small auto repair shop 2 towns over, dated 3 days before Emily vanished. showing a silver sedan matching her vehicle description being brought in for a routine inspection that Emily herself never documented in her records. The service was minimal: oil check, tire pressure adjustment, basic interior cleaning, but what mattered was not what was done, it was who authorized it, because the signature on the paperwork was not Emily's, and it was not a known family member. It belonged to a man listed only as Daniel H. No last name fully recorded, no verified address attached, payment in cash, and a note on the invoice that read simply, "Customer requested seat adjustment for taller driver preference." Donovan stared at that line for a long time without speaking, because suddenly the mystery of the moved driver's seat stopped being a strange detail and became a deliberate act. An action taken before Emily disappeared, not after, which changed everything about how the timeline had been understood for more than a decade. If the seat had already been adjusted days earlier, then someone else had already been using or preparing to use her vehicle, which meant access had occurred before the disappearance, which meant proximity, trust, opportunity, or control, and now the investigation that had once been defined by absence began to pivot toward presence. The presence of someone who had been inside Emily's life in a way no one had properly documented. Donovan reopened financial records with renewed urgency, cross-referencing every transaction, every card swipe, every ATM withdrawal in the months leading up to 2001. But the digital trails were thin in that era, fragmented, inconsistent, stored across systems that no longer existed in usable form. Yet even in that limitation, patterns began to emerge in the form of repetition, the same locations appearing too often, the same time windows overlapping in ways that felt accidental at first, until they didn't. A small cluster of transactions near a roadside diner just outside town caught his attention, not because of the amount, but because of frequency. Emily had stopped there several times in the month before she disappeared, always alone according to receipts, always at night, always for short intervals. And when Donovan tracked the ownership of the diner at that time, he found that it had been partially managed by a subcontractor connected to automotive services in the same county as the repair shop. It was not proof, not even close, but it was a thread, and cold cases are built entirely from threads that refuse to break under pressure. Then came the witness who should have been impossible to find after so many years, a former gas station clerk who had been working the night shift near the highway exit where Emily's car was later discovered, who initially remembered nothing when first contacted, but after hearing specific details about the silver sedan and the timing, something changed, and she recalled a woman standing near the edge of the parking lot that evening, not panicked, not visibly injured, but speaking to a man she described as calm, controlled, unusually composed for the situation. The clerk could not remember faces clearly, but she remembered one detail with unsettling clarity: the man's posture. He stood slightly angled between the woman and the road, as if controlling the direction of attention, and she remembered the woman eventually getting into the car willingly, or at least without visible resistance, which complicated everything, because it introduced ambiguity into a case that had long been treated as a straightforward abduction. Donovan wrote every word down without interruption, then asked the question he already feared the answer to, and the clerk hesitated before saying she was not sure she had seen fear on the woman's face, only confusion, like someone following instructions they did not fully understand. That single sentence reshaped the entire emotional architecture of the case. Because fear implies struggle, resistance, external force, but confusion implies manipulation, familiarity, trust, or deception, and deception leaves a different kind of trace in investigations, not violent, not immediate, but slow, layered, and often invisible until long after the fact. The case file began to expand again, but this time it expanded inward, tightening around a smaller and smaller circle of possibilities, and Donovan's attention locked onto the identity of Daniel H. The man from the repair invoice, the man no one had fully tracked down in 2001, the man who had slipped through the cracks of incomplete record-keeping and outdated databases. He requested archived employment rosters from every automotive service within a 50-mile radius, a process that took months because many records had been destroyed or transferred, but eventually a partial match surfaced. A technician who had worked briefly at the same repair shop during the relevant period, who remembered a colleague who matched the description of Daniel H. Someone who was not officially listed in payroll records for long, someone who appeared suddenly and left just as quickly. The technician described him in fragments, not reliable enough for identification, but consistent enough to build a shape: tall, physically strong, quiet, someone who avoided personal conversation, someone who worked only short-term contracts, someone who never stayed long enough for people to learn much about him. And then came the most troubling detail, a habit that stood out in hindsight. This man often asked customers about their routines, not directly, but through casual conversation disguised as curiosity, asking where people drove most frequently, what time they left work, whether they ever changed their schedules unexpectedly, questions that at the time sounded like small talk, but now read like mapping behavior. Donovan began to feel the case shifting under his hands, not solving itself yet, but tightening, like a mechanism slowly aligning after years of misalignment. And he knew from experience that this stage was the most dangerous, because it creates the illusion of certainty before certainty actually exists. Still, the evidence was converging, the repair record, the seat adjustment, the witness account, the pattern of Emily's last movements, all pointing toward a single point of contact that had never been properly interrogated in 2001 because no one had yet connected the fragments. He requested a full forensic re-examination of the recovered sedan, this time using modern methods that did not exist at the time of the original investigation: advanced DNA extraction from trace biological material, enhanced fiber analysis, and microscopic residue mapping from interior surfaces that had previously been deemed inconclusive. The car had been sitting in storage for years, untouched, sealed, preserved in the quiet suspension of evidence that waits for technology to catch up with it. And when the forensic team reopened the sealed containers, they did so knowing that even the smallest fragment could rewrite everything. What they found was not dramatic at first: no obvious blood evidence, no visible struggle, nothing that immediately suggested violence. But beneath the surface, embedded deep within fabric fibers near the driver's seat adjustment mechanism, there were traces of biological material that did not belong to Emily Carter. And when those traces were finally processed through modern databases, the system returned a partial match that had not existed in 2001, a profile that had never been available to investigators during the original search, a name that now existed in law enforcement records across multiple states for reasons unrelated at first glance to Emily's disappearance, but connected in ways that would take time to fully understand. Donovan sat alone in the evidence room when he received the preliminary report, reading the same line over and over again, because partial matches in cold cases are not answers, they are openings, and openings lead either to closure or to something far more unstable. Outside the window, the town that had once moved on began to unknowingly drift back toward the past it had tried to forget, because somewhere in the growing stack of renewed evidence, something was about to cross the threshold from suspicion into accusation, and once that line is crossed, cold cases stop being history and become present tense again. The moment the partial DNA match appeared on Detective Donovan's screen, the case stopped behaving like an old disappearance and started acting like something alive again, something that had been dormant but never truly dead, because cold cases don't sleep, they wait in fragments, and now those fragments were beginning to assemble into a shape that no one in 2001 had been able to see. The match was not perfect, not clean enough for immediate arrest, not strong enough for a courtroom, but strong enough to demand attention. And in cold case work, attention is everything, because attention is what turns forgotten evidence into active investigation again, and Donovan had learned over the years that most breakthroughs do not arrive as revelations, they arrive as pressure. The profile tied to the DNA trace belonged to a man whose name surfaced across multiple jurisdictions in unrelated investigations, never convicted in anything major, never fully anchored to a single crime scene, but always close enough to suspicion to appear in supplementary reports. The kind of name that never disappears from law enforcement databases, even when it never quite lands in a courtroom. And yet none of that mattered without context, because names alone don't solve disappearances, patterns do, and Donovan began to rebuild the pattern again, not from Emily outward, but from the DNA inward, tracing every known movement, every archived employment record, every service receipt, every witness statement that had once been dismissed as too vague to matter. What emerged was not a single line of action, but a radius, a geographic and behavioral circle that expanded around key locations connected to Emily's final week: the office, the auto repair shop, the roadside diner, the highway exit where her car was discovered, all forming points on a map that now refused to look random. Donovan spread the map across his office wall again, but this time he did not use colored pins to mark uncertainty. He used them to mark convergence, because everything was beginning to converge, and convergence in cold cases is the moment when coincidence stops being a comfortable explanation. The first real shift came when he revisited the auto repair shop records with forensic accountants, not just to confirm the existence of Daniel H., but to understand the flow of cash payments during that period. And what they discovered was subtle but unsettling, a series of small, irregular cash transactions tied to vehicle servicing that did not match typical customer behavior, always under different names, always slightly below reporting thresholds, always routed through different clerks, who did not remember the same customers in consistent ways. It suggested not just one man moving through a system, but a method, a pattern of avoiding permanence, a way of interacting with places just long enough to leave influence without leaving identity, and Donovan recognized it immediately as something he had seen before in other cold cases, not identical circumstances, but identical behavior. Control without visibility. Presence without traceability. That was when he stopped thinking of Daniel H. as a possible witness or incidental contact and started thinking of him as an organizing force within the timeline, someone who may not have been present at every stage of Emily's disappearance, but whose actions may have structured the conditions under which it occurred. The gas station clerk's statement returned to him again and again, not the details of faces, but the posture she described, the way the man positioned himself between Emily and the road, because positioning is not accidental in behavioral profiling, it is directional, and direction implies intent. Donovan requested a behavioral analysis consultation from a state-level cold case unit, feeding them only the raw data without interpretation, because he wanted confirmation without bias, and when the analysts returned their assessment, they did not use dramatic language, they used clinical language that somehow felt worse. The subject exhibited signs consistent with pre-contact environmental conditioning, they wrote, suggesting gradual integration into victim routine prior to disappearance. That phrase changed the emotional tone of the entire investigation. Gradual integration. Not sudden abduction. Not random encounter. But preparation. Emily's life, in those final days, may not have been interrupted suddenly, but influenced slowly, subtly, in ways she herself may not have recognized until it was too late to differentiate between normal routine and engineered familiarity. Donovan leaned back in his chair when he read it, because it meant the disappearance might not have begun on the day she vanished. It might have begun weeks earlier, inside conversations that seemed ordinary, inside services that seemed routine, inside interactions that no one would ever think to question. He returned to Emily's phone records again, this time focusing not on outgoing calls, but on incoming patterns, and there, buried in frequency spikes, he noticed something that had been overlooked for years: short-duration calls from unidentified numbers that occurred at consistent intervals during her final month, always brief, always ending before voicemail, always followed by slight shifts in her daily routine that no one had previously connected. Nothing in isolation suggested wrongdoing, but together they formed rhythm. And rhythm is one of the most dangerous things to find in a cold case, because rhythm implies design. Donovan tracked those numbers through outdated carrier records, a process that required legal requests, archival retrievals, and manual cross-referencing of systems that no longer communicated with each other. And the result was incomplete but revealing. The numbers traced back to prepaid devices purchased in cash, activated briefly, and discarded. Disposable identity. That phrase appeared in Donovan's notes without him consciously writing it. He stared at it for a long time, then circled it, then drew lines outward from it across the map. The center of those lines pointed repeatedly toward the same cluster of locations tied to automotive services and transient employment contracts, reinforcing the presence of someone moving through systems designed to be forgetful. Meanwhile, forensic analysts returned with a second layer of DNA interpretation from the sedan evidence, this time isolating secondary transfer material, microscopic skin cells embedded in areas unlikely to be touched by the vehicle's primary driver unless prolonged contact had occurred. And when cross-referenced with modern databases, the partial profile grew stronger, not definitive, but increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Donovan received the updated report late at night, alone in the office, the building nearly empty except for the hum of fluorescent lights, and he read the same lines repeatedly, because cold case investigators do not celebrate progress, they interrogate it. Every new confirmation raises new questions. Every answer expands the perimeter of uncertainty. What troubled him most was not the identity itself, but the implication that Emily's vehicle had been handled extensively by someone other than her, not in a single moment of crisis, but over time, which meant the car itself may have been part of the mechanism of disappearance long before it was abandoned in that gravel lot. He returned once more to the image of the driver's seat, pushed back too far for Emily's frame, a detail once dismissed as post-incident manipulation, now reinterpreted as pre-incident configuration, and that shift in interpretation changed everything about how investigators should have been looking at the timeline. Because if the vehicle had already been adapted for another driver, then Emily was not the only person operating within that system. She was one variable inside a controlled environment. Donovan requested preservation logs from the evidence storage facility where the sedan had been held for years, and what he found there added another layer of unease, because during one of the early transfers of evidence, a notation had been made by a junior technician in 2002 referencing non-standard seat position confirmed prior to long-term storage, a comment that had never been escalated or included in formal reports. A single line, lost inside administrative documentation, ignored for over a decade, but now reinterpreted as critical. The realization hit him slowly, not as a moment of clarity, but as accumulation, because the case was no longer defined by what was missing, but by what had been consistently present and consistently overlooked. Someone had been close enough to Emily's life to influence her movements without triggering immediate alarm. Someone had access to her vehicle before it disappeared. Someone had interacted with systems that left fragmented but traceable records across multiple locations. And now, after years of silence, that someone was no longer invisible in theory, only in practice. Donovan stood in front of the map again, this time not searching for new connections, but tracing the existing ones until they formed a narrow corridor of probability leading away from Emily's final known location toward a set of overlapping jurisdictions that had never coordinated effectively during the original investigation. That lack of coordination, he realized, may have been the reason the case went cold in the first place. Not because evidence was absent, but because it was scattered. And scattered evidence is the easiest kind to ignore. Outside, the city continued its normal rhythm, unaware that a case believed to be buried was beginning to surface again, piece by piece, document by document, trace by trace, until the past was no longer something remembered, but something approaching. The investigation had reached a point where every new document felt less like discovery and more like excavation, as if Donovan were digging through layers of time that had hardened into something almost geological, because cold cases do not stay static, they compress, they settle, and over years they become indistinguishable from silence until someone disturbs them again. By the fourth phase of review, the name Daniel H. had become less of an identity and more of a shadow moving through administrative gaps, appearing in one system only to vanish in another, never fully anchored, never fully traceable, and that pattern itself was beginning to feel intentional, because randomness rarely survives this long without collapsing into contradiction. But deliberate fragmentation can endure indefinitely if no one connects the edges. Donovan requested a full interagency data sweep, something that in 2001 would have been impossible, and even in the present required layers of authorization, because what he was now looking for was not just a suspect, but continuity, evidence that the same behavioral signature existed across multiple unrelated files, and when the results began to return, they did not arrive as a single confirmation, but as echoes. Similar descriptions in archived reports from neighboring counties. Unresolved traffic stops involving transient workers matching the same physical profile. Witness statements that had been logged but never elevated beyond initial intake. None of it directly referenced Emily Carter, but all of it described variations of the same presence. A tall man, quiet, methodical, moving through service industries, always temporary, always unremarkable on paper, yet consistently remembered in fragments by people who could never fully place him again. Donovan began compiling those fragments into a behavioral profile, not officially yet, but internally, because investigators often build their understanding of a subject long before they are allowed to name them, and what emerged was increasingly unsettling in its consistency. The subject did not appear to escalate violence in visible stages. Instead, he appeared to insert himself into systems that already contained predictable human behavior, places where trust is routine, where transactions are brief, where identities are assumed rather than verified. Gas stations, auto repair shops, roadside diners, temporary staffing agencies. Each location offered access without scrutiny, familiarity without verification, and Donovan started to see a structure forming behind the randomness, a deliberate preference for environments where attention naturally dissolves. That realization reframed everything about Emily's final movements. If she had interacted with this individual, it likely would not have felt like a threat at the time, because nothing in those environments signals threat until after the fact, and by then the context has already been rewritten by absence. Donovan reopened the gas station clerk interview notes again, focusing not on what she saw, but on what she did not question at the time, because in retrospective analysis, omission often carries more weight than memory. The clerk had mentioned the man was calm. Too calm. She used that phrase twice in her recorded statement, once when first interviewed, and again when asked to clarify months later, and calmness in crisis situations is one of the most deceptive indicators investigators encounter because it can suggest control, familiarity, or detachment, none of which are inherently criminal, but all of which can be weaponized. He cross-referenced that statement with another forgotten interview from a tow truck driver who had been called to the same highway exit area weeks before Emily's disappearance, a man who recalled assisting a stranded motorist involving a silver sedan, though at the time he had not been able to identify the driver and the report had been closed as routine assistance. But buried in the margins of that report was a note written by a responding officer, mentioning an unusual interaction between male subject and female driver prior to tow, dismissed at the time as non-relevant because no incident had occurred, no complaint had been filed, and the vehicles had separated without issue. Donovan requested the original audio logs. They were degraded, partially lost, preserved only in fragments of analog transcription, but enough remained to reconstruct tone if not full dialogue, and what he heard, or rather what he interpreted from the surviving segments, introduced a new level of unease into the investigation. The interaction was not confrontational. It was procedural, as if instructions were being followed, as if roles had already been established before the encounter even began. That concept, roles established before contact, shifted Donovan's entire understanding of the case again, because it suggested premediation not in a single act, but in a sequence of interactions that normalized dependency or compliance over time. He sat with that idea for hours, tracing it across the whiteboard until it intersected with Emily's phone activity again, particularly the prepaid call patterns that had already been identified in earlier analysis. If those calls were part of a behavioral rhythm, then each interaction may have served a purpose beyond communication, possibly reinforcement, confirmation, or subtle direction, not overt instruction, but guidance disguised as coincidence. Donovan requested psychological consultation from a retired behavioral analyst who had worked cold cases involving long-term manipulation patterns, and when the analyst reviewed the compiled data, he did not hesitate before identifying what he believed was present. Systematic normalization of proximity, he said, a phrase that Donovan repeated silently after the call ended. Systematic normalization. It sounded clinical, detached, almost sterile, but its implication was deeply personal, because it meant that Emily's disappearance may not have been the result of a single moment of vulnerability, but the culmination of repeated small adjustments to what she perceived as normal. That idea made Donovan return again to the auto repair shop invoice, the one with the seat adjustment note, because it now represented something more significant than vehicle servicing. It represented calibration, the adjustment of environment to fit someone other than the registered owner. And calibration implies preparation. He ordered a physical reconstruction of the sedan's interior using modern forensic imaging, a digital simulation that allowed investigators to model seating position, driver reach, visibility angles, and ergonomic constraints, and when Emily's documented height and posture were applied to the simulation, the mismatch became obvious in a way that had never been emphasized in 2001. The seat was not merely adjusted. It was optimized for someone significantly taller, suggesting prolonged use by another driver prior to the disappearance, not incidental contact, but sustained adaptation. Donovan stared at the simulation results for a long time without speaking, because this shifted the entire timeline again, moving control of the vehicle away from a single moment of abduction and toward a period of shared or transferred access. That realization forced him to revisit one of the earliest assumptions of the case, that Emily's disappearance began in the parking lot of her workplace. But now that assumption no longer held stable under scrutiny, because evidence suggested influence began earlier, possibly days or weeks before that final drive. He expanded the timeline backward, pulling in everything from her routine grocery receipts to her office entry logs, looking for anomalies that might indicate behavioral disruption. And while most data remained ordinary, one detail stood out in subtle contradiction. Emily had taken 2 unscheduled late drives in the week prior to her disappearance, both unaccounted for in her usual routine, both occurring after brief phone activity involving unidentified numbers, and both ending in locations near major highway access points. No witnesses. No surveillance confirmation strong enough for identification. But the pattern was too consistent to ignore. Donovan felt the case tightening again, not with clarity, but with pressure, the sense that multiple systems were converging toward a single unresolved center, and that center was no longer a mystery of absence, but a question of access. Who had access to Emily? Who had access to her vehicle? Who had access to her time? Because every new layer of evidence was pointing less toward a moment of disappearance and more toward a structured sequence of contact that had been unfolding without detection. And somewhere inside that structure, hidden within incomplete records and unremarked interactions, the truth was still intact, not lost, not erased, simply waiting for the final connection that would turn fragments into consequence. Donovan no longer treated the case as a disappearance in the traditional sense, because disappearances imply a single moment of rupture, a point in time where everything changes instantly. But what he was seeing now was not rupture, it was construction, something built slowly in layers that only revealed themselves when examined in reverse. The name Daniel H. had become the axis of that construction, not because it explained everything, but because everything seemed to rotate around it without ever fully landing on it, like a gravitational pull that shaped movement without exposing its source. And Donovan knew from experience that the most dangerous kind of suspect is not the one who leaves evidence, but the one who leaves structure behind. He began a formal reclassification of the investigation, elevating it from missing person to suspected abduction with prolonged pre-contact interaction, a designation that immediately changed the scope of available resources, because once a case is labeled as structured rather than spontaneous, agencies are forced to reconsider everything they previously dismissed as coincidence. Task forces were reactivated in adjacent jurisdictions. Archived reports were pulled from storage facilities that had not been opened in over a decade. Digital migration teams began reconstructing fragmented databases from early 2000 systems that had never been fully integrated into modern networks. And for the first time in years, Emily Carter's case file stopped being static and started expanding again. But expansion did not bring clarity immediately. It brought noise, because every system that reopened its archives contributed additional fragments, unrelated incidents, partial matches, incomplete statements, and Donovan found himself in the middle of an expanding field of information that only made sense when viewed from a distance, yet refused to align when examined closely. Still, one thread remained consistently visible through the noise. The auto repair shop connection. The invoice with the seat adjustment note. The recurring presence of Daniel H. across administrative gaps. Donovan requested original payroll audits from the shop again, this time with forensic accountants specializing in historical fraud reconstruction, and what they uncovered was not dramatic in isolation, but devastating in accumulation. Several short-term employees had passed through the business during the relevant period, none officially recorded in full employment databases, all paid partially in cash, all leaving minimal trace once they departed, and among those records, one pattern repeated itself with uncomfortable precision. Each transient worker cycle coincided with irregular vehicle servicing requests involving silver sedans. Not always Emily's vehicle, but similar models, similar service notes, similar vague customer requests involving seating adjustments or interior modifications. It was not evidence of a single crime. It was evidence of a method. Donovan wrote one word on the board in capital letters without realizing he had done it. Access. Because that was what the entire investigation had quietly become about, not violence, not abduction in isolation, but access to systems, access to people, access to routines that could be subtly altered without triggering alarm. He returned to Emily's life again, this time focusing not on the final week, but the final month, and as he layered financial records over communication logs, a pattern began to emerge that had previously been invisible because it did not appear dramatic enough to notice. Emily had begun adjusting her schedule in small increments, not enough to raise concern, but enough to create variability, leaving work slightly later, taking different routes home, stopping at locations she had not previously frequented, and each change aligned loosely with the timing of unidentified phone activity. Donovan did not assume causation yet, but correlation at this density could not be ignored. He requested cell tower triangulation reconstruction, a painstaking process given the era of the data, but even partial reconstructions revealed movement clusters that suggested repeated presence near highway-adjacent zones, places where vehicles could enter and exit without prolonged observation, places designed for transit rather than permanence. The gas station clerk's statement resurfaced again in this context, especially the detail about calmness, because now calmness did not feel like personality. It felt like environment, a state produced by familiarity rather than reaction. He brought the clerk back in for a follow-up interview, though she initially resisted, insisting she had already told everything she remembered. But when shown the reconstructed timeline maps, something changed in her recollection, not dramatically, but enough to shift emphasis. She began to describe not just the man, but the interaction sequence. Not what was said, but how it unfolded. She remembered the woman, Emily, pausing before entering the vehicle. Not hesitating in fear, but pausing as if confirming something internally. As if a step in a process had been reached. That detail unsettled Donovan more than anything else so far, because it suggested compliance shaped by expectation rather than force. He asked the clerk if she remembered any sense of urgency in the situation. She said no. No urgency. That absence of urgency became its own form of alarm. Because abductions typically carry urgency, even when controlled, but what she described felt procedural, like something already agreed upon, even if unconsciously. Donovan left that interview with a growing sense that he was no longer investigating a single event, but a sequence of conditioned interactions that culminated in disappearance. Meanwhile, forensic teams returned additional DNA refinement from the sedan evidence, this time focusing on trace compounds embedded in fabric fibers near the passenger side, and what they isolated was not only biological material, but environmental residue consistent with multiple indoor automotive service locations, suggesting prolonged exposure of the vehicle to controlled workshop environments beyond what was originally documented. That discovery reframed the car again, not as a passive object, but as a shared space, one that may have been modified, accessed, and utilized in ways that extended beyond Emily's ownership. Donovan stood in the evidence room for a long time after reading the report, because each new layer of interpretation was stripping away the simplicity of the original assumption that Emily had simply vanished from a parking lot. Now the parking lot felt like an endpoint rather than a beginning, a final transfer point in a process that had already been underway. He returned to the idea of Daniel H. Again, but this time he stopped treating the name as a person and started treating it as a function, because every trace associated with it behaved less like identity and more like operational signature, appearing only when certain conditions were met, disappearing when scrutiny increased, re-emerging in slightly altered forms in adjacent systems. Donovan requested deeper analysis from federal data specialists, asking not just for identity matches, but for behavioral overlap across unrelated case files involving similar operational signatures, and what came back was a cluster of reports spanning multiple counties, none officially connected, but sharing structural similarities too consistent to dismiss. In each case, there were short-term interactions. In each case, there were vehicle-related modifications or adjustments. In each case, there were witnesses who described calm, controlled male figures interacting with women in transitional environments like gas stations, roadside stops, or repair facilities. None of the cases were solved. None of them had resulted in conviction. But together they formed a pattern that Donovan could no longer ignore. He wrote another word beneath access on the board. System. Because if access was the mechanism, then system was the environment that allowed it to function repeatedly without detection. And somewhere within that system, Emily Carter had not simply disappeared. She had been absorbed. Donovan began to feel something unfamiliar in long investigations like this, not certainty, not relief, but compression, the sense that all scattered fragments were being drawn toward a single point with increasing force. And in cold case work, that feeling is both dangerous and necessary, because it often appears right before a breakthrough or right before a collapse of assumptions that investigators have relied on for years. The system he had written on the board was no longer just a theory. It was beginning to behave like an explanation that refused to stay contained, expanding outward as more jurisdictions fed him their archived fragments, each one adding structure without adding clarity, and that contradiction told him he was close to something real but not yet fully visible. He ordered a complete reconstruction of Emily Carter's last 30 days, not just movements, but interactions, environmental exposures, and digital traces, and this time he brought in analysts who specialized in behavioral reconstruction rather than traditional forensic review, because traditional methods were still anchored to singular events, while what he suspected now was distributed across time. The reconstructed timeline came back as a layered model rather than a linear sequence, and what stood out immediately was not a single anomaly, but repetition patterns that suggested external influence embedded within routine behavior. Emily's deviations from her normal schedule were small, but they were not random. Each deviation occurred within narrow windows following unidentified communication events. Each deviation resulted in proximity shifts toward highway-accessible zones. And each deviation, when mapped spatially, overlapped with known locations tied to automotive services or transient employment activity. Donovan did not yet call it manipulation in official terms, but internally he had already crossed that threshold, because no ordinary life produces that level of synchronized movement without external pressure. The behavioral analyst assigned to the case summarized it in a single line that Donovan wrote down immediately. Routine disruption appears externally paced. Externally paced. Not self-driven. Not incidental. Paced. Like timing in a controlled system. That word changed how Donovan looked at everything that followed. He returned again to the gas station clerk, this time not to ask what she saw, but to reconstruct what she might have been observing without understanding its significance. And during the interview she paused repeatedly, as if trying to align memory fragments with something she had never previously considered meaningful. She described the man's calmness again, but this time added something new, something she had not mentioned before because she had not thought it relevant. He did not look surprised by Emily's presence. He looked expected. That single word introduced a new dimension into the case, because expectation implies prior knowledge of timing, location, or behavior, and prior knowledge transforms encounter into coordination. Donovan pressed gently for clarification, and she explained that the man did not behave like someone encountering a stranger, but like someone meeting a known variable in a planned sequence. Emily, she said, did not seem fully alarmed at first, more like uncertain whether something was supposed to happen at that moment. That detail struck Donovan harder than anything else in weeks of investigation, because it suggested cognitive dissonance at the moment of interaction, not fear, not resistance, but misalignment between expectation and reality. He closed the interview recording and sat in silence for a long time afterward. Then he reopened the auto repair documentation again. The seat adjustment note. Customer requested seat configuration for taller driver preference. He had read it dozens of times before, but now it read differently, not as a mechanical detail, but as confirmation of prior adaptation. The car had not been altered for convenience. It had been altered for continuity. Donovan requested surveillance history from nearby highway exits, even though he knew the limitations of early 2000s infrastructure, most footage long since overwritten or degraded, but fragments still existed in archived municipal storage, and what emerged was partial, low resolution, and incomplete, yet still suggestive. A silver sedan appearing in multiple transitional points, always at night or late evening, always without clear identification of driver, always moving through the same corridor of roads connecting service locations and highway access points. None of it was definitive, but consistency was beginning to outweigh clarity. He expanded the search to vehicle registration anomalies, focusing on silver sedans registered in surrounding counties that had undergone frequent short-term transfers or temporary plates during that period. And while the dataset was incomplete, one cluster of registrations stood out for repeated administrative irregularities. Vehicles that changed ownership multiple times within short intervals. Vehicles serviced repeatedly at the same auto repair network. Vehicles that appeared in unrelated incident reports but were never flagged as suspicious individually. Donovan began marking them not as suspects, but as environment, because the more he studied them, the more they resembled tools embedded within a system rather than isolated objects. Meanwhile, forensic teams delivered another refinement from the DNA analysis. this time identifying low-level trace compounds consistent with adhesive materials used in aftermarket interior modifications, suggesting that parts of the vehicle's interior may have been altered beyond standard servicing. That detail reframed the seat adjustment again, not as a single service event, but as part of a broader pattern of modification that could accommodate different users over time. Donovan felt the structure of the case tightening again, but this time the pressure was directional, not chaotic, as if all investigative paths were slowly aligning toward a shared origin point that had remained hidden beneath years of fragmented data. He returned to Daniel H. once more, but now he stopped treating the identity as uncertain and began treating it as a behavioral constant, something that could appear in different forms but maintain the same operational footprint. He requested cross-case behavioral matching from federal analysts again, and this time asked them to ignore names entirely and focus only on structural similarities in victim interaction timelines, and when the results came back, they were more extensive than he had anticipated. Multiple cases across different states shared overlapping characteristics. Short-term environmental integration prior to disappearance. Vehicle access preceding victim separation. Calm, controlled male presence reported in transitional public spaces. Subtle disruption of victim routines over time rather than sudden escalation. None of these cases had been solved at the time of reporting, but now they were beginning to resemble fragments of a larger pattern. Donovan stood in front of the board again, and beneath system he wrote another word without fully intending to. Architecture. Because what he was seeing was no longer isolated behavior, it was structural design, something that functioned only when multiple elements interacted in specific sequence. And in that structure, Emily Carter was not the only missing person. She was the entry point into something that extended far beyond a single disappearance, something that had remained invisible for years not because it was hidden, but because it was distributed across systems that were never designed to be viewed together. Donovan stopped thinking in terms of individual clues after that, because individual clues were beginning to feel misleading, like looking at fragments of glass without realizing they all belonged to the same shattered mirror, and what mattered now was not what each piece showed on its own, but what image they formed when assembled correctly. The word architecture on the board began to take on a weight of its own, not as metaphor, but as operational reality, because every new dataset fed into the investigation reinforced the same unsettling conclusion, that Emily Carter's disappearance was not an isolated deviation from normal life, but a structured outcome of repeated, low-visibility interactions across multiple environments. He requested a full temporal overlay of all known data points tied to Emily's final 6 weeks, and when analysts returned with the visualization, it did not look like a timeline anymore. It looked like a lattice, intersecting lines of communication, movement, and environmental exposure, forming a pattern that resisted simple interpretation. What stood out immediately was not where Emily went, but how predictably she shifted between points of instability, almost as if her decisions were being gently redirected rather than forcibly changed, and Donovan knew how dangerous that interpretation was because it implied influence without awareness, which is one of the hardest things to prove and one of the most unsettling things to consider. He revisited the auto repair shop records again, but this time he did not focus on names or invoices. He focused on timing, and what emerged was a synchronization pattern between vehicle servicing events and Emily's behavioral deviations that had never been noticed because no one had previously aligned the datasets. Each time the vehicle was serviced or adjusted in ways not fully documented, Emily's routine shifted shortly afterward. Not dramatically, not immediately obvious, but enough to create measurable drift over time. Donovan circled those points on the timeline until they formed a repeating sequence, and the sequence itself began to suggest coordination, not coincidence. He brought in a statistical analyst from a federal behavioral unit, someone trained to identify non-random clustering in human activity, and presented the data without narrative framing, only raw events, and when the analyst reviewed it, he remained silent longer than Donovan expected. Finally, he said the pattern was statistically inconsistent with independent behavioral evolution. Independent behavioral evolution. That phrase stayed in Donovan's mind long after the meeting ended, because it meant Emily's changes in behavior were unlikely to have developed on their own within the observed time frame, which implied external structuring influence. Not force, not overt control, but structured interaction shaping routine. Donovan leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a long moment, because this was the point in the investigation where interpretation begins to replace evidence, and he knew that if he was wrong, everything he was building would collapse instantly. But if he was right, then the case was far larger than a missing person. It was a system of influence operating beneath detection thresholds for years. He returned to the gas station clerk recordings again, replaying the same segment repeatedly, focusing not on words but on rhythm, pauses, hesitation, and something he had previously overlooked emerged with new clarity. The timing between Emily's movements and the man's responses in the clerk's recollection followed a structured cadence, not conversational spontaneity, but coordinated pacing, as if both participants were following an unspoken script. Donovan felt a shift in interpretation that he could not ignore. He called the clerk again, asking her to focus specifically on body language rather than memory of dialogue, and after a long pause she described something she had not articulated before, a sense that Emily was following steps. Not physically forced, not emotionally panicked, but sequentially aligned, as if each action was part of a process she was already familiar with. That phrase hit Donovan harder than anything else so far. Following steps. Because steps imply structure, and structure implies design. He immediately expanded the investigation into prepaid communication records again, focusing not on content but on temporal spacing, and what he found reinforced the same idea, that communication events were not random, but consistently timed in relation to Emily's behavioral shifts. Short calls, consistent intervals, minimal duration, always preceding movement changes. Donovan began to see it not as communication, but as calibration signals. Small adjustments to behavior triggered through external contact. He did not yet label it officially, but internally the word conditioning had already formed. Meanwhile, forensic analysis of the vehicle continued to produce subtle but increasingly significant findings, including microscopic where patterns on the steering column and seat adjustment mechanisms that indicated repeated repositioning by multiple drivers over a sustained period. Not one-time access. Not incidental use. Repeated, structured interaction with the vehicle interior. That discovery reframed the entire physical evidence landscape because it suggested the car had functioned as more than transportation. It had functioned as a shared operational environment. Donovan requested historical maintenance logs from surrounding service stations again, expanding the search radius, and this time a new cluster of records appeared, showing repeated anonymous vehicle service requests tied to different names but identical service instructions, all within the same geographic corridor. He mapped them carefully, and what emerged was a corridor of activity stretching between automotive shops, highway exits, and transient service locations, forming a route that was never officially designated but functionally consistent over time. It was not a path in the traditional sense. It was a network, and Emily's disappearance sat directly within it. Donovan wrote another word under architecture. Corridor. Because now the investigation had a spatial dimension that explained movement patterns across multiple cases, not just Emily's, but several unrelated disappearances that shared similar structural characteristics. He requested cross-case comparison again, this time focusing exclusively on victims who had experienced routine disruptions prior to disappearance, and the results returned a disturbing consistency across jurisdictions that had never coordinated their findings. Different names, different towns, same behavioral structure, same transitional environments, same absence of clear immediate escalation. The implication was unavoidable. What he was looking at was not a single perpetrator in the traditional sense, but a repeatable process embedded in environments that allowed it to function undetected. Donovan sat with that realization for a long time because it shifted responsibility away from individual moments of violence and toward systemic vulnerability. And somewhere inside that system, Emily Carter had transitioned from routine life into something carefully structured enough that even her disappearance had followed an internal logic that investigators had not recognized at the time. Outside the office, the city continued its normal rhythm, unaware that the case it believed had ended years ago was no longer a file in storage, but a pattern emerging into visibility, one connection at a time, one reconstruction at a time, until the architecture of what happened to Emily Carter began to reveal itself not as mystery, but as design. Donovan no longer experienced the investigation as a search in the traditional sense, because searches imply direction towards something unknown, But what he was dealing with now felt more like translation, as if the evidence had always been there, but written in a language that only became legible when enough fragments were placed side by side. The corridor he had mapped on the board had begun to evolve into something more precise, less like a route and more like a behavioral ecosystem, a repeating network of locations where the same patterns of interaction appeared across different cases, and every new file added to it reduced the probability that what he was seeing was coincidence. He requested a full statewide audit of unresolved missing persons cases from the early 2000s, specifically those involving adult females last seen in transitional environments such as parking lots, roadside stops, or service areas, and when the data returned, it did not arrive as a clean dataset, but as a fragmented archive requiring manual normalization. That alone told Donovan something important. These cases had never been designed to be compared. They had been stored in isolation. And isolation, he realized, is what allows patterns to remain invisible. As analysts began aligning the cases chronologically and geographically, Donovan noticed something that tightened his focus immediately, because several of the disappearances clustered not only in time, but also around infrastructure nodes similar to those already linked to Emily Carter's timeline. Automotive service corridors, highway exit clusters, small independent diners with inconsistent staffing records, places where movement was constant but oversight was minimal. He marked them on the board, and the density of overlap became impossible to ignore. What he was seeing was not just repetition, but preference. A repeated selection of environments that shared specific operational weaknesses. Donovan brought in a second behavioral analyst, this time someone specializing in environmental criminology, and presented the evolving map without explanation, letting the structure speak for itself, and the analyst's first reaction was not interpretation but silence. Then he said something Donovan would later write down verbatim. This is not victim selection. This is environmental exploitation. Environmental exploitation. The phrase reframed everything again, because it removed randomness entirely and replaced it with systemic usage of predictable human infrastructure. Donovan leaned forward immediately, asking what that implied in practical terms, and the analyst explained that certain environments naturally suppress vigilance due to routine, familiarity, and transactional behavior, and when those environments overlap with transient populations, they create predictable blind spots. Blind spots that do not need to be created, only identified. The implication was simple but unsettling. Whoever was responsible did not need to control individuals directly. They only needed to operate within systems where individuals were already least likely to notice manipulation. Donovan returned again to Emily's case file, but this time he was not looking for her movements alone. He was looking for where those movements intersected with systemic vulnerability, and what he found was a repeating pattern of transitional exposure points occurring shortly before each behavioral deviation. Short stops, unscheduled detours, brief phone activity, each one seemingly insignificant in isolation, but together forming a prelude structure that consistently preceded movement toward highway-adjacent zones. He began reconstructing those prelude points as a separate layer of the timeline, and when he overlaid them with the automotive service data, the alignment became sharper than before. It was no longer just correlation. It was sequencing. Donovan called it internally a trigger cascade, though he did not use that term in official documentation yet because he needed confirmation beyond structural alignment. Still, the pattern persisted. Short communication, behavioral shift, proximity movement toward corridor locations, vehicle interaction, then disappearance. Each case followed variations of the same sequence, and Emily Carter's file now sat directly inside that pattern rather than outside it. He brought the updated model to the task force, and for the first time since reopening the investigation, he saw hesitation from other investigators, not disbelief, but discomfort, because accepting the model meant acknowledging that multiple cases previously treated as unrelated may share a structural origin. One investigator asked the question directly, "Are we looking at a single offender?" Donovan did not answer immediately, because the evidence was no longer pointing toward a simple answer. Instead, it pointed toward something that behaved like a system more than a person. He finally said, "We're looking at something that uses repeatable conditions." The room stayed silent after that. Meanwhile, forensic updates from Emily's vehicle continued to arrive, and each one added detail without altering direction, including deeper analysis of fabric compression patterns in the driver's seat that confirmed sustained use by someone significantly taller over a prolonged period. Not occasional use. Sustained interaction. The implication of that finding pushed the timeline backward again, suggesting that control or influence over the vehicle may have occurred well before the final day of disappearance. Donovan revisited the auto repair shop records with renewed urgency, focusing now on employee rotation logs and subcontracted service work, and what emerged was a fragmented employment structure characterized by short-term contractors who were never fully integrated into payroll systems. Among those records, several references appeared to a recurring pattern of temporary workers who specialized in fleet servicing and customer vehicle adjustments, a vague classification that had never been scrutinized in detail during the original investigation. Donovan requested personnel cross-referencing with known identities from other jurisdictions, and what came back reinforced his growing concern, because the same cluster of transient workers appeared in multiple automotive service environments across different counties, always briefly, always inconsistently documented, always leaving behind minimal traceable employment history. It was not enough to identify a single individual, but it was enough to identify a labor pattern that enabled consistent access to vehicles without sustained accountability. Donovan wrote another word beneath corridor on the board. Entry. Because what he was now seeing was not just movement between locations, but structured access into systems that were never designed to track transient influence over time. And Emily Carter, he realized, had not simply been moved through space. She had been moved through a network of controlled entry points, each one appearing ordinary on its own, but together forming a pathway that only became visible when viewed as a whole. The investigation was no longer about where she went. It was about how she was allowed to move at all. Donovan's board no longer looked like an investigation space. It looked like a mapped organism, something with arteries and nodes and repeating cycles of movement that behaved less like human decision-making and more like an engineered flow of interaction. And the longer he stared at it, the more uncomfortable the realization became that nothing in Emily Carter's case was actually isolated anymore. Everything connected. Not neatly, not cleanly, but persistently. The entry layer he had written beneath corridor had started to generate its own implications, because once access points are identified, the question is no longer who entered, but how often entry becomes routine without anyone noticing it has stopped being exceptional. Donovan requested a full audit of all known vehicle access points linked to the automotive service network identified in earlier records, and when analysts compiled the data, they found something that initially looked like administrative noise, repeated short-term contracts tied to multiple service locations across county lines, all using slightly different business names but sharing overlapping personnel structures. On paper, they were separate businesses. In practice, they behaved like a rotating system of labor and service exchange. And that realization pushed Donovan further away from the idea of a single offender and closer toward something more structured, something that operated through distributed participation or at least distributed access. He did not say that aloud in the briefing room, but he felt the shift internally, because cold cases rarely evolve this way unless the original assumptions were fundamentally incomplete. He returned again to Emily Carter's timeline, but now he approached it differently, not as a sequence of events, but as a sequence of controlled transitions, and when he replotted her final month using that lens, the pattern became sharper, almost uncomfortable in its precision. Every deviation in her routine corresponded to a transition point in the external system. Not necessarily direct contact, but proximity, exposure, intersection. Donovan began labeling these points as contact-adjacent events, because he still needed a cautious framework, but internally he understood they functioned as something more significant than coincidence. He called in the behavioral analyst again, and this time presented not just Emily's data, but the cross-case cluster, and the analyst spent a long time examining the overlay maps without speaking. Finally, he leaned back and said something that reframed the entire investigation again. These aren't isolated disappearances. These are convergent access failures. Convergent access failures. Donovan repeated the phrase slowly, because it suggested something more systemic than any single perpetrator narrative could explain. When access points overlap across multiple cases, he explained, it creates predictable vulnerabilities, and those vulnerabilities can be exploited repeatedly without requiring identical methods or even identical individuals. Donovan asked him directly whether that meant coordination. The analyst hesitated. Coordination, he said carefully, or structural repetition. That distinction mattered. Coordination implies intent. Structural repetition implies environment. And Donovan could feel the case leaning more toward the second interpretation with every new dataset, even though part of him resisted that conclusion, because environment-based explanations are harder to resolve and harder to prosecute. Still, the evidence continued to align. He revisited the auto repair shop data again, focusing on employee overlap patterns during high-frequency service periods tied to vehicle modifications, and what he found was a recurring cycle of staffing changes that aligned suspiciously with spikes in unidentified vehicle servicing activity. It was not one person moving through the system. It was the system itself remaining open to repeated entry. Donovan wrote a new layer beneath entry. Rotation. Because the workforce structure itself seemed designed, or at least perfectly suited, for temporary access without accountability. He stepped back from the board and realized the investigation had fundamentally changed shape. It was no longer centered on Emily Carter as an isolated victim profile. It was centered on a repeating structural vulnerability that she had moved through unknowingly. He returned to the gas station clerk recordings again, but this time he focused on something different, not memory content, but emotional framing, and he noticed something subtle in the clerk's language that had previously gone unexamined. She never described panic in isolation. She described absence of confusion about roles. Emily, in her recollection, did not behave like someone resisting an unknown situation. She behaved like someone following an understood sequence that felt slightly misaligned, but not entirely unfamiliar. Donovan replayed that segment multiple times. The phrase, "not unfamiliar," stuck with him. Because familiarity without clarity is one of the most dangerous states in behavioral manipulation. It allows compliance without conscious resistance. He documented it, but did not label it conclusively. Meanwhile, forensic updates on the vehicle interior added another layer of complexity, identifying repeated micro-adjustments to the driver's seat mechanism that could only occur through sustained interaction over time, suggesting that whoever was using the vehicle did not simply drive it once, but interacted with it repeatedly across multiple occasions. That finding forced Donovan to reconsider the final stage of the timeline entirely. The disappearance was no longer a single transfer of control. It was the endpoint of repeated shared usage, which meant Emily's presence in her own vehicle had been gradually displaced, not abruptly removed. He stared at the report for a long time, then closed it without saving notes, because for the first time, the structure of the case felt too coherent to be comfortable. And in cold case investigations, coherence is not always comfort. Sometimes it is the final stage before contradiction collapses into revelation. Donovan looked at the board again, at access, system, architecture, corridor, entry, rotation, and realized he was no longer building a theory. He was reconstructing a mechanism. And somewhere inside that mechanism, Emily Carter had not simply disappeared. She had been processed through it, step by step, until the final point of contact no longer looked like an event, but like the inevitable result of everything that came before it. Donovan reached a point in the investigation where the language on his board no longer felt like labels, but like pressure points, each word marking a stage where something had shifted in ways no one in 2001 had been equipped to recognize, and now those stages were collapsing inward toward a single unresolved core. Access, system, architecture, corridor, entry, rotation. Each layer had once looked like explanation. Now they looked like steps in a process that had been running long before anyone realized there was a process at all. He requested a full forensic reevaluation of every recovered artifact tied to Emily Carter's case. Not just the vehicle, but clothing fibers, archived witness notes, service records, and digital fragments that had been dismissed as non-critical in the original investigation, and what returned was not new evidence in the traditional sense, but recontextualized evidence that behaved differently under modern analytical frameworks. One of the most significant shifts came from the recalibration of time intervals between known events. What had once appeared as irregular gaps in Emily's timeline now showed measurable consistency when aligned with external system activity, particularly automotive service records and communication bursts tied to prepaid devices. Donovan watched the visualized model update in real time, and for the first time, he saw something that resembled synchronization. Not perfect, not obvious, but persistent enough to resist dismissal. He called in the behavioral analyst again, this time without presenting theory, only the updated synchronized model, and the analyst studied it for a long time without speaking before finally asking a question that reframed everything. How long would someone need to observe a routine before they could begin to influence it without detection? Donovan did not answer immediately, because the question assumed something he had been avoiding stating outright. That Emily's routine may not have been disrupted randomly. It may have been learned. The analyst continued, carefully, explaining that in systems involving repeated low-stakes interactions, influence does not require force, it requires predictability, and once predictability is established, even minor interventions can create cascading behavioral shifts over time. Donovan felt the weight of that concept settle across the entire case structure. Cascading shifts. Not sudden changes. Gradual redirection. He returned again to the gas station clerk's testimony, focusing now on the moment Emily was seen entering the vehicle. And this time the detail that stood out was not hesitation or calmness, but timing alignment, because the clerk could not clearly distinguish whether Emily entered immediately or after a brief pause that felt almost procedural, like confirming a step rather than reacting to a situation. That distinction mattered more than anything else, because procedural behavior implies internalized sequence. Donovan asked for the interview audio to be cleaned and enhanced again, and when technicians returned with a clearer version of the same segment, he noticed something subtle in the clerk's tone that had been previously buried in noise. She was uncertain, not about what she saw, but about how to categorize what she saw. And that uncertainty itself became evidence of structural ambiguity in the interaction. Meanwhile, forensic reconstruction of the vehicle interior reached a new stage, this time simulating repeated occupancy patterns based on where distribution across seat fabric, steering interface, and control surfaces, and the results showed something that could not be easily dismissed. The driver's seat had not only been adjusted, it had been used in alternating configurations over time, suggesting multiple repositioning events consistent with different operators, or at least one operator with inconsistent seating requirements due to external adjustments. Donovan read that line twice, then again, because it confirmed something he had not fully wanted to articulate. The vehicle had not been passively possessed. It had been actively shared. He requested a full cross-analysis of automotive service logs and transient worker records once more, but this time he asked analysts to look specifically for overlapping temporal windows where vehicle servicing, staffing changes, and behavioral deviations aligned. What came back was a compressed cluster of correlation points spanning multiple cases, including Emily Carter's, all converging on similar timeframes involving short-term service access and transitional environmental exposure. It was not enough to identify individuals, but it was enough to identify structural vulnerability windows. Donovan began marking those windows on the board as gaps, but the more he marked, the less they looked like gaps, and the more they looked like deliberate intervals of accessibility within a larger system. He wrote one final word beneath rotation: windows, because that was what the investigation had become centered on. Not people, not single events, but intervals in which systems allowed influence without detection. The behavioral analyst looked at the board and finally said what Donovan had been circling for days without stating outright. If this is consistent across cases, then the question is not who did it first. He paused. It's how the structure keeps allowing it. That statement hung in the room longer than anything else said during the entire investigation, because it removed the comfort of singular attribution. Donovan stepped back from the board and realized that Emily Carter's disappearance no longer sat in isolation anywhere in the model. It sat inside a repeating structural condition that had existed before her case and likely continued after it. And for the first time since reopening the file, he felt the investigation shift from pursuit to exposure. Not chasing a person, but revealing a mechanism that had remained hidden in plain sight for years, operating quietly across systems that were never designed to be viewed together. Outside, the night deepened, and the city continued moving through its usual rhythms, unaware that somewhere inside its history, a pattern was being fully assembled for the first time, and once assembled, it would no longer remain invisible. Donovan no longer measured progress in breakthroughs, because breakthroughs implied a clean break from uncertainty, and what he was experiencing now was the opposite, a tightening convergence where every new confirmation made the structure clearer, but no less disturbing. Windows had become the most important word on the board, not because it explained everything, but because it defined when everything became possible. He ordered a final consolidation of all cross-jurisdictional data tied to the identified behavioral cluster, instructing analysts to remove all victim identifiers and focus only on structural timing, environmental conditions, and access patterns. And when the clean dataset returned, it revealed something that had been hidden simply because no one had ever looked at cases that way before. The same structural window intervals appeared across multiple disappearances spanning several years. Not identical dates, not identical locations, but identical conditions. Short-term service access points, temporary staffing fluctuations in automotive environments, preceding communication bursts tied to untraceable prepaid systems, and then behavioral deviation sequences in victims shortly before disappearance. Donovan stared at the compiled visualization for a long time without speaking, because the pattern was no longer theoretical. It was reproducible. The behavioral analyst broke the silence first, saying that what they were looking at resembled repeatable environmental exploitation cycles. But his tone had changed, because even he seemed to understand that labeling it did not reduce its implications. Donovan asked the question that had been building for days. If this is a cycle, what triggers it? The analyst hesitated, then answered carefully. Access windows. The phrase landed heavily in the room, because it suggested that the system did not operate continuously, but intermittently, activating under specific structural conditions where vulnerability aligned across multiple points simultaneously. Donovan returned once again to Emily Carter's timeline, but now he viewed it through that lens exclusively, and what had once appeared as scattered irregularities now formed a synchronized alignment of exposure events. Each communication burst, each deviation in routine, each vehicle interaction, each transition toward highway-adjacent environments. All of it now appeared to fall within a compressed sequence of overlapping windows. He felt the case shift again, but this time there was no sense of expansion, only narrowing. He brought in forensic transportation analysts to reconstruct traffic flow patterns around known corridor locations during the relevant period, and when the simulation ran, it showed predictable clustering of vehicle movement at specific times of night, aligning with service station operations and transient staffing shifts. The corridor was not just physical. It was temporal. Certain hours created predictable overlaps between human movement and system vulnerability. That realization reframed everything, because it meant the disappearance did not happen in isolation. It happened inside a predictable structural interval that repeated across time and location. Donovan wrote beneath windows. Intervals. Meanwhile, a new forensic update arrived regarding Emily's vehicle, this time focusing on electronic remnants embedded in the car's internal systems. And although the technology from 2001 was limited, modern recovery techniques extracted residual diagnostic signals that suggested repeated ignition activity inconsistent with single driver usage patterns. Multiple ignition cycles over short time spans. Irregular engine restarts. Brief usage intervals. The car had not simply been driven. It had been repeatedly activated and deactivated in ways that suggested multiple engagements across different occasions. Donovan read the report twice, then placed it on the desk without speaking, because it confirmed what he had been increasingly reluctant to articulate. The vehicle had functioned within the system, not outside it. He requested a full psychological reconstruction of Emily's final month again, but this time focusing on perceived behavioral confidence versus uncertainty markers in her documented decisions, and what emerged was subtle but significant. Emily did not show abrupt behavioral breakdown. Instead, she showed incremental alignment shifts, small adaptations in timing and route selection that suggested gradual normalization of altered routine structures. The behavioral analyst summarized it in a phrase that Donovan immediately wrote down. Progressive acceptance of altered environmental patterning. That phrase carried more weight than it should have, because it implied adaptation rather than resistance. Donovan closed his eyes briefly, then reopened the board, and realized something that had been forming for days but had not yet fully solidified. If all these systems were aligned, then Emily's disappearance was not an isolated endpoint. It was the final step in a structured sequence that had begun long before the last known sighting. And that sequence was not unique to her case. He looked at the cluster of other cases again, and for the first time, he stopped seeing them as separate investigations. They were instances, variations of the same structural pattern under different conditions. He wrote one final line beneath intervals: systemic repeatability. The behavioral analyst read it and did not challenge it. Instead, he simply said, "Then you're not dealing with a case.